The early morning sunlight streamed through the thin, beige curtains of Sophia Grant's apartment, casting warm, dappled patterns on the hardwood floor. The apartment, nestled on the top floor of a modest 3-story building, was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city waking up drifted through the windows. A distant car horn, the faint bark of a dog, and the rhythmic hum of early commuters on the subway below. Sophia stretched lazily on her couch, the soft fleece of her blanket wrapped tightly around her. She had spent the previous night working on a graphic design project for a demanding client, and her laptop still sat open on the coffee table, a reminder of the hours spent tweaking colors and fonts. The half-empty mug of tea, long gone cold, balanced precariously on the edge of the table. She eyed it with mild annoyance, but made no effort to move it. Today was supposed to be a light day, a chance to breathe before diving into her next round of deadlines. The apartment, though small, exuded a cozy charm. The walls were adorned with a mix of minimalist art prints and her own sketches. A bookshelf stood in the corner, filled with a mix of novels, self-help books, and an alarming number of true crime anthologies. Sophia had always had a fascination with the darker aspects of human nature. It wasn't morbid curiosity, she told herself, but rather an attempt to understand the world's complexities. Her friends teased her endlessly for her obsession with crime documentaries, often joking that she'd scare herself into a perpetual state of paranoia. But Sophia always shrugged it off. "It's just research," she would say with a sly grin, though deep down, she did feel a pang of unease every time she heard a creak in the middle of the night. Yawning, she threw off the blanket and padded toward the bathroom, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The bathroom was modest but well kept, with white tiles that gleamed under the overhead light. A small shelf above the sink held an assortment of skincare products, neatly organized, a habit she had picked up during her college years when chaos seemed to reign everywhere else in her life. The mirror, slightly fogged from last night's humidity, reflected her tired face back at her. Her dark brown hair was in a loose bun, and faint dark circles framed her hazel eyes. "I need more sleep," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. Sophia turned the shower handle, and the pipes groaned in protest before warm water gushed from the shower head. The sound of the water hitting the tub was oddly soothing, drowning out the faint noises of the city below. She stepped into the shower, letting the hot water cascade over her shoulders, washing away the lingering tension from the week. For a moment, the world outside faded, and all that existed was the comforting embrace of the steam and water. Her mind wandered, as it often did in the shower. She thought about the project she had just finished, a sleek, modern logo for a startup tech company. The client had been particularly finicky, demanding countless revisions until Sophia had finally hit the mark late last night. She couldn't decide whether she felt satisfaction or sheer exhaustion. Probably both, she thought with a wry smile. The water began to grow hotter, and she adjusted the handle slightly, her thoughts shifting to the upcoming weekend. Maybe she'd visit her friend Lily, who had been pestering her to check out a new cafe downtown. Or perhaps she'd stay in, binge-watch another crime series, and treat herself to a quiet night of wine and takeout. The thought was tempting. As the steam thickened around her, she noticed the faint outline of her reflection in the bathroom mirror, blurred and distorted. There was something oddly hypnotic about the way the condensation rolled down the glass, creating streaks that danced in the low light. She tilted her head. watching absent-mindedly until the sound of the water brought her back to the present. Sophia reached for her shampoo, her hand knocking over a bottle of conditioner in the process. The hollow sound of plastic hitting the tub echoed louder than expected, startling her. She froze for a moment, her heart giving a tiny leap before she laughed softly. "Get a grip, Sophia," she muttered, shaking her head. Living alone had its perks, but it also meant every little sound seemed amplified. Every creak or groan of the apartment's old bones, a potential harbinger of something sinister. Still, she couldn't deny the faint unease that had settled at the back of her mind. It was the price she paid for her true crime addiction, she supposed. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise more ominous. But this was her home, her sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let irrational fears ruin her peace. The water began to cool slightly, and she reached out to turn the handle, pausing as a faint sound reached her ears. It was soft, almost imperceptible, and for a moment, she thought she had imagined it. She tilted her head, listening intently. There it was again, a faint gurgling noise coming from the drain. She frowned, crouching slightly to get a better look. The drain was clean, the water swirling downward without issue. But the sound persisted, a low, almost rhythmic gurgle that sent a small shiver down her spine. "It's just the pipes," she told herself firmly. The building was old, and the plumbing had seen better days. She straightened up, determined to shake off the unease, but as she reached for her towel, she thought she heard something else, a whisper. It was so faint she could barely make it out, a single word carried on the air. She froze, her hand hovering mid-reach. The whisper came again, slightly louder this time, but still soft enough to make her question her sanity. "I see you." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the bathroom. There was nothing there, just the steady drip of water from the shower head and the faint hum of the fan overhead. Her eyes fell to the drain, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw something. Movement, a shadow perhaps. But it was gone in an instant, leaving her doubting what she had seen. Her rational mind kicked in, scrambling for an explanation. It had to be the plumbing, or perhaps her own overactive imagination. She had been working too hard, not sleeping enough. Yes, that was it. Stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on her. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her towel and stepped out of the shower, wrapping it tightly around herself. The bathroom felt colder than before, the air heavy with a tension she couldn't explain. She avoided looking at the drain as she wiped the fogged mirror, her reflection staring back at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "You're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself, though her voice sounded shaky even to her own ears. "There's nothing there." But as she turned off the light and left the bathroom, the faintest of whispers echoed behind her, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the hum of the fan. "I see you." The warm steam filled the bathroom, curling and swirling against the cool tiles like restless spirits. Sophia stood beneath the cascade of water, her eyes closed as the heat soaked into her skin. The noise of the city outside had faded, muffled by the rush of water, leaving her in a cocoon of solitude. Her muscles relaxed, and her thoughts drifted. It was moments like these that she cherished, when the world felt distant and the mundane stresses of life dissolved, even if just for a little while. She tilted her head back, letting the water stream over her face, washing away the residue of sleep and the remnants of a late night spent staring at her laptop screen. She made a mental note to drink more water and get more sleep. the kind of promises she knew she wouldn't keep, but felt better making anyway. With a quiet sigh, she reached for her shampoo, massaging it into her scalp as the scent of lavender and chamomile filled the air. Then it came again, a sound. At first it was subtle, barely noticeable over the spray of water. A faint gurgle, like the drain was struggling to swallow the water rushing into it. Sophia paused, her fingers still in her hair, and opened her eyes. The sound was irregular, rising and falling in pitch, almost like the murmur of a distant conversation. She frowned, lowering her hands and standing still, her ears straining to catch the faint noise over the shower. "Just the plumbing," she muttered under her breath, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. The building was old, and the pipes were notorious for making odd noises. She had heard her neighbor in 3B complain about it last week. Nothing to worry about. But even as she reassured herself, the noise persisted, growing slightly louder. It wasn't just gurgling now. It sounded almost deliberate. She turned off the water abruptly. The sharp hiss of the faucet echoed in the small bathroom, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint drip of water from the shower head and the gentle hum of the ventilation fan. Sophia stood frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the drain. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, perhaps hair clogging the grate or soap residue clinging to the metal, but it looked perfectly normal, clean even. And then she heard it. "I see you." The words were soft, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. Sophia's breath hitched, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her gaze darted to the drain, her heart racing as she struggled to comprehend what she had just heard. It must have been her imagination, she thought, or perhaps a trick of the water echoing through the pipes. That had to be it. There was no other explanation. And yet she couldn't shake the chill that prickled her skin. She crouched slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the tub for balance, her eyes fixed on the dark circle of the drain. The closer she got, the more she realized how small and vulnerable it looked. Just a tiny hole surrounded by white porcelain. Harmless. But as she leaned in, peering into the inky darkness below, the whisper came again, faint but clear. "I see you." Sophia scrambled back, her feet slipping slightly on the wet surface of the tub. She caught herself before falling, her back pressed against the cool tiles, her chest heaving as she stared at the drain. Her mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Maybe it was her upstairs neighbor. What was her name again? Tanya? Maybe Tanya had her bathroom fan on and the sound was traveling through the vents. Or maybe the building's plumbing was just echoing in a strange way. But deep down, Sophia didn't believe that. Her instincts screamed at her to leave the bathroom, to retreat to the safety of her bedroom and pretend this never happened. But something kept her rooted in place, a morbid curiosity, or perhaps sheer disbelief. She shook her head, forcing a nervous laugh. "You're losing it, Sophia," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "Too much work, not enough sleep. That's all this is." Still, she couldn't take her eyes off the drain. It sat there, silent and unassuming, as if mocking her fear. She inched closer again, her hands gripping the edge of the tub, and leaned forward. Her reflection in the shiny surface of the grate stared back at her, distorted by the curves of the metal. And then she saw it. Movement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something shifted in the darkness below the grate, a ripple of shadow that sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. She yelped, stumbling out of the tub and grabbing a towel to wrap around herself. Her hands were shaking, her heart hammering against her ribcage as she backed away from the drain, her eyes never leaving it. "Okay," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Okay, this is ridiculous. You're scaring yourself over nothing." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the image of that shadowy movement, the way it seemed alive. She grabbed her phone from the sink counter and opened the flashlight app, pointing it toward the drain. The bright beam illuminated the inside of the small opening, revealing nothing but clean, smooth metal and the faint glisten of water. No shadows, no movement, no voices. Sophia let out a shaky breath, her fear slowly giving way to a mix of relief and embarrassment. She felt foolish now, standing there half naked with her phone pointed at a drain, like it was some kind of weapon. But as she turned to leave, the whisper returned. "I see you." Sophia froze, her blood running cold. This time, there was no mistaking it. The words were clearer, louder, as if they were being spoken directly into her ear. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, and stared at the drain. The light from her phone wavered as her hands shook, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the tiles. The drain was bubbling now, small bursts of water pushing up through the grate as though the plumbing were alive. The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another until they became a chorus of disjointed words. "See you, see you." Sophia dropped her phone in her panic, the device clattering to the floor and plunging the room into semi-darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the faint hum of the fan. She grabbed her phone and bolted from the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Leaning against the door, she pressed her hands to her face, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. What was that? She couldn't explain it, couldn't even begin to process it. She wanted to believe it was all in her head, a product of stress and exhaustion, but the memory of that voice, those words, was seared into her mind. "I see you." The phrase echoed in her thoughts as she sat on her bed, clutching her towel tightly around her. The bathroom was silent now, but she couldn't bring herself to go back in. Whatever was happening, whatever she had heard, wasn't something she could just brush off. Her safe, familiar apartment now felt foreign, as if something sinister had seeped into its walls. Sophia stared at the closed bathroom door, her fear growing with every passing second. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain: she couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong, terribly, inexplicably wrong, and she had no idea what to do about it. Sophia didn't sleep well that night. The whisper, that chilling phrase, "I see you," looped endlessly in her mind like a scratched record. Even after she had locked the bathroom door, stuffed a towel under the crack, and retreated to the furthest corner of her bedroom, the voice lingered. It was so soft, so faint, and yet it had burrowed itself into her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't remove. By 3 a.m., she had abandoned all hope of falling asleep. She lay on her bed, scrolling through her phone, searching for explanations. Strange noises from drains and plumbing issues causing voices returned pages of benign results. Air pockets in the pipes, vibrations from neighboring units, the hum of old plumbing, rational scientific answers, and yet none of them fit what she had heard. Her search inevitably took a darker turn. She stumbled onto paranormal forums, places where users shared their experiences with ghosts, demons, and unexplained phenomena. One thread in particular caught her attention. Voices in the pipes. Should I be worried? The original post described whispers coming from bathroom drains, eerie phrases that seemed to be directed at the listener. Sophia's stomach twisted as she read the responses. Some claimed it was the work of malevolent spirits, entities trapped between worlds, while others dismissed it as delusions caused by stress or lack of sleep. But one comment stood out. If the voice knows your name, leave immediately. Sophia put her phone down, her heart racing. The voice had said her name, twice. She sat up in bed, running her hands through her hair as she tried to steady her breathing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She was tired, stressed, and her overactive imagination was running wild. That was the only explanation. By the time the first rays of sunlight peeked through her curtains, Sophia had convinced herself that everything could be rationalized. Exhaustion played tricks on the mind, and plumbing in an old building like hers was bound to act up. She would call a plumber first thing in the morning, and they'd find some logical explanation for the strange noises. Maybe there was a clog in the pipes, or an issue with the ventilation system. She just needed to be proactive. Later that morning, Sophia made the call. The plumbing company assured her they could send someone out the following afternoon, which meant she had an entire day to endure in the meantime. She avoided the bathroom as much as possible, opting to brush her teeth in the kitchen sink and skipping her morning shower. Every time she walked past the bathroom door, she felt a faint chill, as if the air surrounding it was colder than the rest of the apartment. To distract herself, she threw herself into work. Her laptop whirred to life as she dove into designing a marketing flyer for a local boutique. Normally, this kind of work soothed her, a blend of creativity and problem solving that kept her mind occupied. But today, her focus wavered. Every creak of the apartment, every hum of the refrigerator, made her flinch. She caught herself glancing toward the bathroom door more than once, her stomach tightening with dread each time. By mid-afternoon, Sophia decided she couldn't take the anxiety anymore. She needed to face the bathroom, to prove to herself that it was just her imagination. She approached the door slowly, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before she finally turned it, pushing the door open. The bathroom looked exactly as it always did, clean, orderly, and bathed in soft, natural light from the small frosted window above the sink. The air was still, the only sound the faint hum of the fan. Sophia stepped inside, her eyes immediately darting to the drain. It sat there, small and unassuming, in the middle of the tub. She forced herself to take a deep breath and crouched down, peering into it. See? Nothing, she muttered aloud, her voice shaky but firm. She grabbed her phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly into the drain. The light illuminated the smooth metal pipe, damp from residual water but otherwise clean. No shadows, no movement, no whispers. Sophia exhaled a laugh, a mix of relief and embarrassment. "You're losing it, Sophia," she said, standing up and running a hand through her hair. "Too many late nights. That's all this is." But as she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something on the bathroom floor. She glanced down and froze. There, lying next to the tub, was a strand of hair. It wasn't hers. Sophia's hair was a light brown, fine and straight, but this strand was different. Coarse, jet black, and far longer than her own. It curled slightly at the end, as if it had been wet and dried in place. Her stomach twisted as she bent down to pick it up, holding it between trembling fingers. How had it gotten there? She hadn't had anyone over in weeks, and she certainly hadn't noticed it before. The logical part of her mind tried to offer explanations. Maybe it had come loose from her own hairbrush, or perhaps it had fallen from her clothing after a trip outside. But deep down, she knew it didn't make sense. She dropped the hair into the trash and washed her hands vigorously at the sink, her eyes flicking nervously to the mirror. As she scrubbed, she noticed something else. Faint, almost imperceptible streaks on the glass. They were long and uneven, as if someone had dragged wet fingers across the surface. Sophia froze, her hands still under the running water, and stared at the marks. She hadn't used the mirror that morning, and even if she had, she wouldn't have left streaks like that. Her breath quickened as she grabbed a towel and wiped the mirror clean, hoping the act would erase not just the marks, but the growing sense of unease clawing at her chest. She turned off the faucet and stepped back, her reflection staring at her with wide, fearful eyes. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "You're overthinking everything." But as she stood there, trying to convince herself, she heard it again. The whisper, faint, almost drowned out by the hum of the fan, but unmistakable. "I see you." Sophia's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes darting to the drain, but it was silent and still. The whisper had sounded closer this time, as if it had come from right behind her. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and stumbled out of the bathroom. Her hands were shaking as she slammed the door shut and locked it, as if that flimsy lock could somehow keep out whatever was haunting her. Sophia spent the rest of the day in a daze, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. She debated calling a friend, maybe staying at someone else's place for the night, but she couldn't bring herself to explain what was happening. What would she say? That she was hearing voices coming from her drain? That her bathroom seemed to have a mind of its own? No one would believe her, and she wasn't sure she even believed herself. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the apartment grew dark, Sophia's anxiety reached a fever pitch. She double-checked every lock, turned on every light, and even shoved a chair under the bathroom doorknob for good measure. But none of it made her feel safe. The memory of that whisper, that soft, chilling voice, was etched into her mind. Sophia sat on her couch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders and staring at the bathroom door. She told herself that everything would be fine once the plumber arrived tomorrow. They would find some logical explanation for the noises, faulty pipes, a vent issue, anything but what her imagination was conjuring. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something a plumber could fix. Sophia woke up the next morning feeling as though she had barely slept at all. Her dreams had been vivid and unsettling, filled with dark, endless tunnels, and the faint sound of whispers echoing all around her. When her alarm buzzed, she bolted upright, her heart pounding as if she had been running. The bathroom door was still shut, the chair she had wedged under the knob in place. For a moment, she thought about canceling the appointment with the plumber. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this was all in her head. But as she shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, the events of the past 2 days came rushing back. The whispers, the strand of hair, the faint streaks on the mirror. No, she decided. Something was wrong, and she needed answers. The plumber arrived at noon. His name was Mr. Grayson, a man in his late 60s with a weathered face, wiry gray hair tucked under a baseball cap, and hands that looked like they had seen decades of hard work. His uniform bore the logo of a local plumbing company, though the stitching was frayed and the colors had long since faded. Despite his appearance, there was something sharp and alert about his eyes, a keen intelligence that made Sophia feel both reassured and uneasy. "Ms. Grant?" he asked, stepping into the apartment and glancing around. His voice was gravelly, like someone who'd spent a lifetime smoking but quit years ago. He carried a heavy toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for coming," Sophia said, trying to keep her voice steady. It's the bathroom." "Most of the time it is," he replied with a wry smile. "What seems to be the problem?" Sophia hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy. "Well, I've been hearing noises from the drain, gurgling mostly, and, other sounds." "Other sounds?" Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, like whispers," she said quickly, regretting it the moment the word left her mouth. She laughed nervously, trying to downplay it. "I mean, it's probably just the pipes, right? Old building and all." He didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Could be. Old plumbing can do strange things. Let me take a look." Sophia led him to the bathroom, her stomach tightening as she opened the door. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. She stood back as Mr. Grayson set his toolbox on the floor and crouched by the tub, his movements deliberate and methodical. He removed the drain cover with a screwdriver, peering into the dark, narrow pipe. He muttered, reaching into his toolbox for a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the inside of the drain. "Doesn't look clogged. Pipes seem clear." Sophia watched him intently, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "So, what's causing the noise?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and began tapping along the bathroom walls, listening for something she couldn't hear. "This building's got some history," he said finally, his tone casual but tinged with something deeper. "Do you know when it was built?" "Not exactly," Sophia admitted. "I think sometime in the 1920s. Why?" "Old buildings like this, they've seen a lot. Sometimes that history leaves its mark." He glanced at her, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You say you've been hearing whispers?" Sophia nodded, suddenly feeling exposed under his gaze. "Yes. It started a couple of days ago. At first I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe someone in another apartment, but it doesn't sound like that." Mr. Grayson tilted his head, considering her words. "You're not the first tenant in this building to say something like that." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the sink, folding his arms. "I've been called out to this building a few times over the years, always for strange noises, mostly coming from the plumbing. Whispers, voices, even footsteps. One tenant swore she saw water running in the tub on its own, but when she went to check, it was bone dry." Sophia's mouth went dry. What causes it?" Mr. Grayson hesitated, his eyes flicking to the drain as if it might start speaking at any moment. "Could be the building settling. Could be vibrations from the subway down the street. Or..." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "Or what?" Sophia pressed. He sighed, lowering his voice as if someone or something might be listening. "There's a story about this building. Back in the 40s, it was a boarding house. The owner rented out rooms to all kinds of people, and one of them was a young woman named Eleanor Fitch. She was troubled, lived alone, kept to herself. People said she was strange, talked to herself a lot. One night, she didn't show up for dinner, and the owner went to check on her. They found her in the bathroom, dead. Sophia's blood ran cold. How did she die? Drowned, he said simply. Right there in the tub. Some people say it was an accident. Others think she did it to herself. Either way, after she died, tenants started reporting strange things. Voices, shadows, water running when no one was using it. Some folks even claimed to hear her crying. The boarding house closed down a few years later, and it sat empty for decades before they renovated it into apartments. Sophia stared at him, her mind racing. You think it's her? Eleanor? I don't know, he admitted, his voice low. But I've learned not to ignore stories like that, buildings like this. They hold on to things, memories, energy. Call it whatever you want, but it doesn't just go away. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, and for a moment, the room seemed darker, the shadows longer. What do I do? She whispered. Mr. Grayson studied her for a long moment before reaching into his toolbox. He pulled out a small jar of salt and handed it to her. Spread this around the edges of the bathroom, he said. It's an old trick, but sometimes it helps. Salt's a purifier. If there's something lingering here, it might keep it at bay. Sophia took the jar, her hands trembling. And if it doesn't work? His expression darkened. Then you need to decide how far you're willing to go to get rid of it. He finished up his inspection, checking the pipes one last time before packing up his tools. I didn't find anything wrong with the plumbing, he said as he headed for the door. But if you hear anything else, you might want to talk to someone who knows about these things. Like an exorcist? She asked, half joking, though her voice wavered. Or a priest, he said with a faint, grim smile. Sometimes that's the same thing. As he left, Sophia stood in the doorway, clutching the jar of salt like a lifeline. The bathroom loomed behind her, quiet and still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting. She closed the door and locked it, her thoughts racing. If Mr. Grayson's story was true, if this building really did hold on to the echoes of its past, then the whispers weren't just random noises. They were a message. And whatever was in that bathroom wasn't done with her yet. Sophia sat on her couch, staring at the jar of salt Mr. Grayson had left her. She hadn't dared to go back into the bathroom since the plumber departed, though the whispers had stopped, at least for now. The air in the apartment felt heavier than before, like a quiet tension lingered in every corner. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Mr. Grayson's story about Eleanor Fitch haunted her. The name rang in her mind like an echo, growing louder with each passing moment. A troubled young woman drowning in her own bathtub, whispers lingering long after her death. It was the kind of story that would have fascinated her in a true crime documentary. But this wasn't a documentary. This was her home. Determined to learn more, Sophia grabbed her laptop and settled in at the kitchen table, where the warm, golden light from the window felt slightly more comforting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to decide where to start. She typed the address of her building into a search engine, followed by history. At first, the results were ordinary. A real estate listing from when the apartments were renovated, an old Yelp review complaining about thin walls, and a brief blurb about the building's location in a historic district. But then, buried on the second page of results, she found a link to a local history forum. The forum post was from several years ago, written by someone who claimed to be a local historian. It detailed the history of her building, which was originally constructed in 1921. The building had been a boarding house for most of its early years, catering to a mix of long-term residents and transients. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression gripped the country, the boarding house became a refuge for those who couldn't afford stable housing elsewhere. Sophia imagined the halls filled with people, men in threadbare suits looking for work, families with too many children squeezed into too small rooms, and young women like Eleanor, trying to make their way in an unforgiving world. But the forum post hinted at a darker side to the building's history. It was described as a hot spot for tragedy, with multiple reports of suicides, accidents, and unexplained disappearances. One story, dated 1934, caught her eye. A man named Joseph Hargrove, a tenant at the time, reportedly disappeared from his room without a trace. According to the post, Hargrove's belongings were left untouched, and the only sign of him was a cryptic message scrawled on the bathroom mirror in what looked like steam. "She's watching." Sophia shivered, glancing toward her own bathroom. It sounded too much like a ghost story, the kind of thing people made up to scare each other. But the detail about the bathroom mirror felt uncomfortably familiar. She couldn't shake the image of the streaks she had seen on her own mirror just the day before. Scrolling further, she found a section dedicated to Eleanor Fitch. The post didn't provide much detail about her life before she moved into the boarding house, but it did describe her as reclusive and unstable. Neighbors claimed she would mutter to herself as she walked through the halls, her arms clutching a worn leather journal. Some speculated that the journal was filled with secrets, poetry, confessions, or even curses, depending on who you asked. Sophia's heart ached for Eleanor. The descriptions painted a picture of a lonely young woman, someone who didn't fit into the world around her. She could imagine the rumors swirling, how quickly people might turn on someone they didn't understand. The forum post mentioned that Eleanor had been in her early 20s when she moved into the boarding house, taking a room on the 3rd floor, the same floor where Sophia now lived. The circumstances of Eleanor's death were shrouded in mystery. Officially, it was ruled an accidental drowning, but rumors suggested otherwise. Some tenants whispered that she had been involved in a love affair that ended in heartbreak, driving her to despair. Others believed she had uncovered something sinister within the building and had been silenced to keep her quiet. The most chilling theory, however, was that she hadn't died by accident or by her own hand. Instead, some believed that the building itself had taken her. Sophia read and reread the details, her hands trembling as she tried to absorb what she was learning. Could it be possible that Eleanor's death had left some kind of mark on the building? That her anguish had seeped into its walls, its plumbing, its very foundation? The post continued, describing how the boarding house began to fall into disrepair during the 1940s and 1950s. The owner, overwhelmed by maintenance costs and a declining number of tenants, began renting out rooms to anyone who could pay, no questions asked. This lack of oversight attracted a rougher crowd, and soon the building gained a reputation for violence and criminal activity. The forum user detailed several incidents: a stabbing in the lobby, a tenant found dead in their bed with no apparent cause, and a woman who claimed she was attacked by something she couldn't see. The building became known as a place where bad things happened, and by the early 1960s, it was nearly abandoned. The Post mentioned that the building sat vacant for decades, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. Local kids dared each other to break in, and urban legends grew around the property. One of the most persistent stories was that of a figure seen in the upper windows at night. Always a woman, her face pale and her hair dripping wet. In the late 1990s, a developer purchased the building and began renovations to turn it into apartments. The construction crews reportedly faced a number of setbacks, tools going missing, sudden power outages, and one worker who quit after claiming he saw a woman standing in the bathtub of one of the units. Despite the challenges, the renovations were completed, and the building was reopened in the early 2000s. But even after its grand reopening, strange stories persisted. Tenants complained about unexplained noises, footsteps in empty hallways, faucets turning on by themselves, and of course, the whispers. A few residents reported seeing wet footprints leading from the bathroom to the bedroom, though no one could explain where they came from. Sophia's chest tightened as she read these accounts. She wasn't alone in what she was experiencing. Others had heard the whispers, felt the presence in the bathroom. But why her? Why now? The final section of the forum post offered one last eerie detail. A tenant who had lived in the building during its boarding house days claimed to have known Eleanor. According to this account, Eleanor had often talked about the water. She said she could hear voices in it, that it carried secrets from places people couldn't see. The tenant recalled her saying something chilling. "The water sees everything." Sophia closed her laptop, her hands trembling. The room felt too quiet, too still. She glanced toward the bathroom door, half expecting to hear the whisper again. But there was nothing, just the hum of her refrigerator and the faint buzz of traffic outside. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. The world outside seemed so normal, so ordinary. But here, in her apartment, she felt as though she had stepped into a different reality. The weight of the building's history pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Sophia spent the rest of the day poring over every piece of information she could find about the building and Eleanor Fitch. She found old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and even a scanned copy of the police report from Eleanor's death. Each piece of the puzzle added to her growing unease. By the time the sun set, her apartment was bathed in shadows, and her nerves were frayed. She knew she couldn't ignore this anymore. Whatever was happening wasn't just in her head, and it wasn't going to go away on its own. Eleanor Fitch wasn't just a tragic figure from the past. She was here, in the whispers, in the shadows, in the water that filled the pipes of Sophia's home. And she wanted something. Sophia just didn't know what. Yet. The air in Sophia's apartment had shifted. She couldn't explain it, but the once cozy space now felt oppressive, heavy, as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. Even the daylight streaming through the windows seemed muted, as if the building was draining the life out of everything inside it. The whispers from the drain had stopped, but their absence didn't comfort her. If anything, it made her more anxious, like the silence was waiting for the right moment to break. Sophia tried to convince herself that she was imagining things. She went about her daily routine as best she could, forcing herself to focus on work and normal tasks. But the unease never left her. Every time she walked past the bathroom door, she felt a cold prickle crawl up her spine, and her eyes darted to the crack beneath the door, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. The first real incident happened 3 nights after she'd spoken to Mr. Grayson. Sophia had spent the evening on her couch, wrapped in a blanket and binge-watching a mindless sitcom to distract herself. By the time she finally decided to head to bed, it was nearly midnight. She hesitated before going into the bathroom to brush her teeth, standing in the hallway with her hand hovering over the doorknob. "It's just a bathroom," she whispered to herself. "You can't be scared of your own bathroom." Steeling herself, she opened the door and flicked on the light. The bathroom looked normal, sterile even. The white tiles gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, and the drain sat innocently in the tub. She avoided looking at it for too long, focusing instead on the mirror above the sink. It was fogged slightly from the humidity, even though she hadn't used the shower all day. She grabbed a tissue and wiped the glass clean, leaning forward to rinse her mouth. As she straightened up, she froze. There was something behind her. In the reflection, a dark shape lingered at the edge of the bathroom, near the shower curtain. It was vague, more a shadow than a person, but it was unmistakably there. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, and she whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. The bathroom was empty. Nothing but cold tiles and the faint hum of the overhead fan. Her eyes darted back to the mirror. The shadow was gone. For a moment, she just stood there, gripping the edge of the sink as her mind raced. Had she imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? She glanced back at the shower curtain, half expecting it to move, but it hung limply, lifeless. "Get it together," she muttered, her voice shaking. "You're just tired." She turned off the light and shut the bathroom door behind her, but the image of the shadow stayed with her long after she climbed into bed. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams of dark figures and faint whispers that seemed to come from deep underground. The next day, Sophia woke to the sound of dripping water. At first, she thought it was the faucet in the kitchen, but when she went to check, everything was dry. Confused, she wandered through the apartment, trying to find the source. The sound led her to the bathroom door, and her stomach clenched. She hesitated, listening. The drip, drip, drip was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She reached for the doorknob but pulled her hand back before touching it. Something about the sound was wrong. It wasn't just water. It was heavier, almost like the sound of wet footsteps. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but the floor was covered in wet footprints. They were small, like a woman's, and led from the tub to the bathroom door. Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the prints, glistening in the pale light. The tub itself was dry. There was no water dripping from the faucet, no sign of where the footprints could have come from. She backed away, her hands shaking. "No," she whispered. "This isn't happening." Sophia grabbed a towel and hurriedly wiped the floor clean, trying to erase any trace of the footprints. But even as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and every creak of the apartment made her flinch. When she was done, she locked the bathroom door and shoved the chair back under the doorknob, her heart still racing. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. That evening, as Sophia sat on the couch trying to lose herself in another sitcom, she heard it again, the sound of running water. Her whole body tensed, and she muted the TV, straining to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the bathroom. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." She tried to ignore it, hoping it would stop on its own, but the sound persisted, growing louder. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and approached the bathroom door. Her hand trembled as she unlocked it and pushed it open. The faucet in the sink was on, water gushing out at full force. Sophia stared at it, her heart pounding. She hadn't touched the faucet all day, and she was certain it had been off when she locked the door earlier. She stepped inside cautiously, reaching out to turn the handle. The water stopped, leaving the bathroom eerily quiet. She stood there for a moment, her hand still on the faucet, before noticing something else. The mirror was fogged again, despite the fact that she hadn't run hot water. Slowly, her eyes drifted to the glass. Words were scrawled across the surface, faint but legible. "Why didn't you help me?" Sophia stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the wet floor. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the message. She wiped it away with her sleeve, her mind racing. This wasn't just her imagination. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her. She bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lock it. For the rest of the night, she sat on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Sophia decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She called her friend Lily and told her she needed to get out for a while. Lily, sensing the panic in Sophia's voice, insisted she come over immediately. Sophia packed an overnight bag, grabbed her laptop, and left without looking back. At Lily's house, she finally felt a semblance of safety. The bright, airy living room and the warmth of her friend's presence were a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of her apartment. She told Lily everything, the whispers, the footprints, the words on the mirror. To her relief, Lily didn't laugh or dismiss her fears. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "That sounds terrifying," Lily said when Sophia finished. "Have you thought about talking to someone, like a paranormal expert?" Sophia shook her head. "I don't even know where to start. And what if they think I'm crazy?" Lily placed a comforting hand on her arm. "You're not crazy. Something's obviously happening. Maybe it's connected to the history of the building. Didn't you say the plumber mentioned something about a woman who died there?" "Eleanor Fitch," Sophia said quietly. The name felt heavy on her tongue, like it carried its own weight of tragedy. "I've been reading about her. She drowned in the building back when it was a boarding house. People say she was troubled." "Maybe she's still there," Lily said softly. "Maybe she's trying to tell you something." Sophia looked down at her hands, her mind racing. If Eleanor was behind the strange events in her apartment, what did she want? And why was she targeting Sophia? The thought made her stomach turn, but deep down, she knew she couldn't run from it forever. If she wanted answers, she would have to go back. For the rest of the evening, Sophia and Lily scoured the internet for information about Eleanor Fitch and the building's history. What they found only deepened the mystery. Old newspaper clippings hinted at more deaths in the building than Sophia had initially realized, and several of them were eerily similar to Eleanor's. A drowning, a slip in the shower, a heart attack in the bathtub. It was as if the water itself was cursed. Sophia didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't because of fear. It was because of determination. If Eleanor was trying to communicate with her, she needed to figure out why, and she needed to do it before whatever was haunting her decided to escalate. Again. Sophia returned to her apartment the following morning, her mind steeled with a fragile determination. The bright sunlight streaming through the windows of the hallway outside her door offered little comfort. Instead, it illuminated the peeling wallpaper and scuffed baseboards, giving the building an unsettling sense of decay she hadn't noticed before. It felt alive, as though the building was waiting for her, anticipating her return. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the door. The stale air of the apartment greeted her, faintly tinged with the metallic smell of stagnant water. Sophia hesitated before stepping inside. The weight of the space pressed down on her shoulders the moment the door clicked shut behind her. The bathroom door was still closed, the chair wedged beneath the knob. She avoided looking at it as she set her bag down on the couch and took a deep breath. "This is my home," she muttered to herself, as though the words would banish the suffocating dread that coiled in her chest. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Not anymore. The first sign that things were getting worse came that evening. Sophia was working on a design project on her laptop, forcing herself to focus, despite the growing unease that gnawed at her. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of her laptop fan. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Her fingers froze on the keyboard, her ears straining to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from the bathroom. At first it was faint, like water dripping into a puddle. But as the seconds passed, the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was knocking on the pipes. Sophia's breath quickened. She closed her laptop and stood, her legs shaking as she approached the bathroom door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just as she began to pull away, the whisper returned. "I see you." Sophia stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She fell hard onto the floor, her hands scrambling for purchase as she stared at the door. The voice was louder this time, more insistent, as though it were right on the other side of the thin wood. The chair blocking the door rattled slightly, as if something on the other side was testing the barrier. "No, no, no," she muttered, crawling backward. Her back hit the couch, and she pulled herself up, clutching the armrest for support. The whispering continued, a low, unintelligible murmur punctuated by her name. "Sophia, help me. Why didn't you help me?" She clapped her hands over her ears, shaking her head as though she could block it out. But the sound wasn't just in her ears. It was in her head, burrowing into her thoughts like a worm. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed, "Leave me alone!" And then it stopped. The apartment was silent again, save for Sophia's ragged breathing. She stayed curled up on the couch for hours, too afraid to move. Her phone lay on the coffee table just out of reach, but she didn't dare go for it. She didn't want to risk looking toward the bathroom again. The following night, Sophia was jolted awake by the sound of water dripping. She hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep, curled up on the couch with every light in the apartment blazing. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore, and glanced toward the bathroom. The door was still closed, but she could hear the faint sound of water running, steady, persistent, like a faucet left on full blast. She stared at the door, her mind screaming at her not to go near it. But something inside her, curiosity, fear, or maybe the invisible pull of whatever was haunting her, forced her to stand. She grabbed the jar of salt Mr. Grayson had given her clutching it like a lifeline, and crept toward the bathroom. The door creaked as she opened it, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The bathroom was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the hallway light spilling in behind her. The faucet wasn't running, but the tub was full of water, dark and murky, as though it had been drawn from the bottom of a stagnant pond. The smell hit her immediately, damp, metallic, and faintly sweet, like rotting leaves. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the salt trembling in her hands. The water in the tub was completely still, its surface smooth as glass. But as she leaned over to peer into it, something moved beneath the surface. A hand. Sophia screamed, stumbling back and dropping the jar of salt. It shattered against the tiles, the sound sharp and piercing. The hand in the water shot upward, fingers pale and skeletal, grasping at the air as though trying to pull itself out. Water sloshed over the edge of the tub, dark streaks spreading across the floor like oil. She turned and ran, slamming the bathroom door shut and shoving the chair back under the knob. Her heart felt like it might burst out of her chest as she collapsed onto the couch, trembling. She tried to call Lily, but her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped her phone. When she finally managed to pick it up, the screen flickered, static filling the display before the device went completely dark. No, she whimpered, clutching the phone to her chest. This isn't happening. Over the next few days, Sophia's grip on reality began to slip. She stopped eating, her appetite replaced by a constant feeling of nausea. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hand reaching out of the tub, or the dark shadow that had loomed behind her in the mirror. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the bathroom. She heard them in the kitchen, in the living room, even in her bedroom. They called her name, begged her for help, accused her of things she didn't understand. Why didn't you help me? You let me die. You can't escape. She tried to fight back. She poured salt around the edges of every room, burned sage she had bought from a metaphysical shop, and recited prayers she barely remembered from her childhood. But nothing worked. The presence in the apartment only seemed to grow stronger, feeding off her fear. One night, as she sat in the corner of her bedroom with the lights flickering overhead, she heard a new sound: laughter. It was soft at first, barely more than a chuckle, but it grew louder, filling the room until it seemed to echo off the walls. Sophia covered her ears and screamed, "Stop it! Leave me alone!" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural voice that sent a chill down her spine. "You belong to me now." By the end of the week, Sophia barely recognized herself. Her reflection in the mirror was gaunt, her skin pale and her eyes hollow. She felt like a stranger in her own body, her thoughts jumbled and fragmented. The apartment felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her, its shadows alive with malice. She stopped leaving the apartment, convinced that whatever was haunting her would follow her if she tried to escape. The whispers and shadows had become her constant companions, their presence as real to her as the furniture in the room. She no longer questioned their reality. She simply accepted it. One night, as she sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the faint glow of flickering candles, she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to return to the bathroom. It was as though an invisible hand was guiding her, pulling her toward the source of her torment. She didn't resist. The bathroom door creaked open, and the air inside was freezing, biting at her skin. The tub was full again, the dark water rippling slightly as though something beneath the surface was waiting for her. The whispers surrounded her, louder than ever, their words overlapping and incomprehensible. She stepped closer, her bare feet slipping on the wet tiles. The water in the tub began to bubble, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. A figure beneath the surface. A woman's face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. "Eleanor," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. The figure reached out, and Sophia felt her legs buckle as the room spun around her. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was Eleanor's voice, clear and sharp. "Now you understand." Sophia woke up hours later, lying on the cold bathroom floor, her body drenched in sweat. The tub was empty, the whispers gone. But as she stared up at the cracked ceiling, she knew one thing for certain. Eleanor wasn't done with her yet. Sophia lay on the cold bathroom floor for what felt like hours, her body trembling and her mind a chaotic storm of fear and confusion. The whispers had stopped, and the bathroom was eerily silent. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself was brimming with unseen tension. She could still feel the faint chill of Eleanor's presence, lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. When she finally mustered the strength to move, she stumbled to her feet and leaned against the sink for support. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. She looked gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were chapped from dehydration. She barely recognized herself. "This has to stop," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I can't keep living like this." But the words felt hollow, a desperate plea to a void that offered no answers. Sophia knew she couldn't face this alone anymore. That afternoon, she called Lily again, her voice shaky as she recounted what had happened. "I can't do this," she said, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I saw her, Lily. I saw Eleanor. She's real, and she's in the apartment." Okay, slow down," Lily said, trying to calm her. "You need help, real help. Have you thought about calling someone who deals with things like this?" Sophia hesitated. She had read enough stories about paranormal investigators and exorcists to know that not all of them were legitimate. But what other choice did she have? The alternative was letting this thing consume her completely. Lily helped her research, and by the evening, they found a local woman named Madame Iris, a medium with a reputation for dealing with hauntings. The reviews on her website were a mix of glowing praise and skepticism, but Sophia was desperate enough to try anything. Madame Iris arrived the next day, a small woman in her late 50s with sharp green eyes and an air of quiet authority. She carried a leather bag filled with candles, crystals, and other tools Sophia couldn't identify. Her presence was calming, though Sophia could sense the weight of her experience in the way she moved and spoke. "This building has a dark history," Iris said as she stepped into the apartment, her eyes scanning the walls as though she could see something Sophia couldn't. "I can feel it already. You weren't imagining things, Sophia. There's something here." Sophia led her to the bathroom, explaining everything that had happened. The whispers, the shadows, the words on the mirror, and the figure in the tub. Iris listened intently, nodding as she unpacked her tools. "Spirits like Eleanor are often trapped by their own pain," she explained. "They're bound to a place or an object because of unresolved trauma. But when they start lashing out like this, it means they want something. They're trying to communicate." "What does she want?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. "That's what we're going to find out," Iris said. Iris began by cleansing the apartment. She lit bundles of sage and palo santo, the fragrant smoke filling the air as she muttered incantations under her breath. She placed salt in the corners of each room and lit black candles in the bathroom, their flickering flames casting strange shadows on the walls. Sophia watched nervously, clutching a crystal Iris had given her for protection. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere in the apartment began to change. The air grew colder, and a faint pressure built in Sophia's chest, making it harder to breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, shifting subtly as though they were alive. "Stay close to me," Iris instructed, her voice firm but calm. She sat cross-legged on the bathroom floor, a bowl of water and a mirror placed in front of her. This is where she is strongest. If she's going to appear, it will be here. Sophia hesitated before sitting beside her, her body tense and her heart racing. The bathroom felt like a different world entirely, dim, cold, and suffused with an otherworldly energy that made her skin crawl. Iris closed her eyes and began to chant, her voice low and melodic. The words were in a language Sophia didn't recognize, but their rhythm was hypnotic, drawing her into a trance-like state. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching toward the ceiling as though pulled by an unseen force. The water in the bowl began to ripple, and the surface of the mirror clouded over with mist. Sophia's breath hitched as the room grew even colder, the chill biting into her skin. And then, the whispers began. At first, the whispers were faint, like distant voices carried on the wind. But they grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of unintelligible words. The air felt heavy, pressing down on Sophia's chest like a weight. She clutched the crystal in her hand, her knuckles white. "Eleanor," Iris called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "We're here to help you. Show yourself." The room went silent. Then, slowly, a figure began to take shape in the mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, amorphous and shifting. But as Sophia stared, the outline of a woman emerged, a pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and long, wet hair that clung to her face. Her expression was one of sorrow and rage, her mouth twisted into a grimace. "Eleanor," Iris said again, her tone gentle but commanding. "We know you're in pain. Tell us what you want." The figure's lips moved, but no sound came out. Sophia's heart pounded as she leaned closer to the mirror, unable to look away. The candles flickered wildly, their flames nearly extinguishing as a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room. And then, Eleanor spoke. "You didn't help me," she said, her voice low and filled with anguish. "You let me drown." Sophia's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "I wasn't even alive when you died." Eleanor's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Sophia felt as though she were being pulled into the mirror. Images flashed through her mind, an old, dilapidated bathroom, a young woman struggling in a tub filled with water, her screams muffled as she thrashed against invisible hands. Sophia gasped, clutching her head as the visions overwhelmed her. "Stop!" Iris commanded, her voice sharp. The connection broke, and Sophia collapsed to the floor, trembling. "She's projecting her memories onto you," Iris said, placing a protective hand on Sophia's shoulder. "She's showing you what happened to her." As Sophia regained her composure, Eleanor continued to speak, her voice trembling with grief. "They watched me," she said. "They heard me scream, and they did nothing. They let me die." "Who?" Iris asked. "Who let you die, Eleanor?" "The others," Eleanor whispered. "The ones who lived here. They knew. They always knew." Sophia's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragmented story. "You're saying the other tenants? They saw you drowning, and they didn't help?" Eleanor nodded, her expression twisting into one of fury. "They heard me. They laughed. They said I deserved it." Sophia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The tragedy of Eleanor's death was worse than she had imagined. Not an accident, but a cruel act of neglect and malice. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Iris asked softly. "How can we help you move on?" For a moment, the spirit was silent. Then she spoke again, her voice echoing with despair. "Tell my story," she said. "Make them remember. Make them pay." Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell your story," she promised. "I'll make sure everyone knows what happened to you." Eleanor's gaze softened, the rage in her expression fading slightly. The air in the room grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirit began to dissipate. The candles burned steadily now, their flames calm and steady. But just as Sophia thought it was over, Eleanor's face twisted into a final warning. "If you forget," she said, her voice low and menacing, "I'll come back." The image in the mirror dissolved, leaving only Sophia and Iris in the dimly lit bathroom. The silence was deafening, but for the first time in days, Sophia felt a sense of clarity. She knew what she had to do. Eleanor's story wasn't over, and neither was hers. The days following Eleanor's confrontation left Sophia both drained and determined. The spirit's warning echoed in her mind. "If you forget, I'll come back." It wasn't just a threat, it was a mandate. Sophia knew she had to honor Eleanor's story, to give voice to the pain and injustice that had silenced her for so long. But the weight of that responsibility was heavy, and the path forward was unclear. Sophia spent the first night after the ritual in a haze, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the pipes, set her nerves on edge. The apartment was quiet now, but the silence felt fragile, as though Eleanor's presence still lingered in the corners, watching and waiting. It wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was guilt. The next morning, Sophia sat at her laptop, determined to dig deeper into Eleanor's life. The fragments of history she had uncovered before now seemed incomplete, like a puzzle missing its most important pieces. Armed with new resolve, she returned to the local history forums, scanned old newspaper archives, and even reached out to the public library for access to their microfilm records. What she found painted a clearer picture of Eleanor Fitch, and it was more tragic than Sophia had imagined. Eleanor had been a young woman in her early 20s when she moved into the boarding house. She worked as a secretary at a nearby factory, a job that paid little and demanded much. Neighbors described her as quiet, often keeping to herself. But beneath her reserved exterior, she had been struggling with deep emotional wounds. Old court records revealed that Eleanor had been abandoned by her family after an incident involving her younger brother, though the details were vague. Sophia also found a series of police reports filed by Eleanor in the months leading up to her death. She had reported hearing voices, seeing figures outside her window at night, and feeling as though she was being watched. The police had dismissed her concerns, labeling her as hysterical and mentally unstable. One report even included a note from the responding officer. Subject appears paranoid and unbalanced. No further action required. The final piece of the puzzle came from an old newspaper clipping about Eleanor's death. It described her drowning as a tragic accident, but made no mention of the rumors Sophia had uncovered. Rumors that the other tenants had ignored her cries for help, or worse, had mocked her as she died. The truth had been buried, forgotten, and Eleanor had been reduced to a footnote in the building's grim history. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling. The injustice of it all burned in her chest. Eleanor hadn't just been neglected, she had been erased. Her pain, her fear, her life had been dismissed as inconsequential. No wonder her spirit had lingered, desperate for someone to finally see her. Sophia knew what she had to do. She opened her laptop and began to write, pouring everything she had uncovered into a detailed account of Eleanor's life and death. She described the neglect and cruelty she had endured, the dismissive treatment by the police, and the eerie events that had followed her death. She didn't shy away from her own experiences, detailing the whispers, the shadows, and the figure in the mirror. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. The article took days to finish. Sophia barely ate or slept, consumed by the need to do justice to Eleanor's story. She reached out to a local journalist she had met years ago at a networking event, sharing what she had written and asking if it could be published. The journalist, intrigued by the chilling narrative and Sophia's evidence, agreed to run the story in a prominent local magazine. When the article was published, it caused an immediate stir. Readers were horrified by the details of Eleanor's life and death, and many expressed outrage at the systemic failures that had led to her suffering. The story gained traction online, with people sharing it across social media platforms. Soon, it wasn't just a local story. It was a viral phenomenon. For the first time in decades, people were saying Eleanor's name. They were acknowledging her pain, her humanity. And though Sophia couldn't know for certain if Eleanor's spirit had found peace, she felt a sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from the apartment. A week after the article was published, Sophia stood outside the bathroom door, her heart pounding. The memory of her last encounter with Eleanor still haunted her, but she knew she needed to face it one last time. She took a deep breath, turned the knob, and stepped inside. The bathroom was quiet. The air was cool but not cold, and the oppressive heaviness that had once filled the space was gone. The mirror was clean, free of streaks or messages, and the drain sat silent and still. Sophia sat on the edge of the tub, her fingers tracing the cool porcelain. "Eleanor," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope you're at peace now. I hope I did right by you." She waited, her breath hitching as she listened for a response. But there was nothing. No whispers, no shadows, no chilling presence. The bathroom was just a bathroom again. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, a mix of relief and sadness. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," she whispered. "I'm sorry no one helped you when you needed it. You deserved better." For a moment, she thought she felt a faint warmth on her shoulder, like the lightest touch of a hand. But when she turned, the bathroom was empty. In the weeks that followed, Sophia began to rebuild her life. The apartment, once a place of fear and torment, felt lighter, almost inviting. She opened the windows more often, letting in the sunlight and fresh air, and she started decorating the space with plants and artwork, reclaiming it as her own. She continued to write, using her platform to share stories of forgotten or marginalized individuals, giving voice to those who had been silenced. Her work became a form of healing, not just for herself, but for others who found solace in her words. Though the memory of Eleanor never truly left her, it no longer haunted her. Instead, it became a source of strength, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of compassion. One evening, as she was tidying up the apartment, Sophia noticed something on the bathroom sink. It was a single strand of black hair, coiled neatly against the porcelain. Her breath caught in her throat, but instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. She picked up the strand carefully, holding it between her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady. "I won't forget." And just like that, the strand of hair slipped through her fingers and disappeared, carried away by a faint, inexplicable breeze. The bathroom door creaked slightly, and for the first time in months, Sophia smiled. Eleanor was gone, but her story would live on. And for Sophia, that was enough. Months passed, and Sophia's life gradually returned to something resembling normal. The suffocating weight of fear that had once consumed her had lifted, leaving behind an uneasy calm. Her apartment, once a prison of whispered voices and chilling presences, now felt strangely serene. The air was lighter, the rooms brighter, as if the building itself had let out a long-held breath. Yet, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that the events of those harrowing weeks had left an indelible mark, not just on her, but on the apartment as well. Her article about Eleanor Fitch continued to ripple through the community. Local historians began digging into the building's past, uncovering even more forgotten stories of tragedy and neglect. Activists used Eleanor's story as a rallying cry to demand better mental health resources and protections for vulnerable people. The name Eleanor Fitch became a symbol of resilience and justice, her once forgotten life now immortalized in public memory. For Sophia, Eleanor's legacy became a source of purpose. She dedicated herself to writing about the stories that others had ignored, stories of people who had been silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. Her work brought her both praise and criticism, but she took it all in stride. She knew that telling these stories wasn't just about justice. It was about giving meaning to lives that had been unjustly overshadowed. One crisp autumn morning, Sophia found herself standing in her living room, surrounded by moving boxes. After much deliberation, she had decided it was time to leave the apartment. While she no longer felt trapped by the memories of what had happened there, she couldn't deny that the space carried too much emotional weight. She wanted a fresh start, a chance to move forward without the constant reminder of Eleanor's presence. As she packed the last of her belongings, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find a man in his late 30s standing there, holding a folder of papers. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and he wore a warm, approachable smile. "Hi, I'm David," he said, extending his hand. "I'm the new tenant. I just wanted to introduce myself and see if you had any tips about the apartment." Sophia hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder at the hallway. She hadn't expected to meet the person who would be taking her place. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she should tell him everything. About Eleanor, the haunting, the whispers. But she quickly decided against it. The apartment felt different now. Whatever darkness had lingered, there was gone. And she didn't want to burden him with a story that might no longer matter. "Hi, David," she said, shaking his hand. "I'm Sophia. Welcome to the building. It's a unique place." He chuckled. I've lived in older buildings before. They all have their quirks. Yeah, she said softly, her gaze drifting toward the closed bathroom door. This one definitely has its quirks. That night, Sophia stayed in a nearby hotel, her belongings already moved to her new apartment across town. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the past few months like a film reel. She thought about Eleanor's face in the mirror, the whispers that had haunted her nights, and the fleeting warmth she had felt after promising to tell Eleanor's story. Despite everything, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's spirit wasn't entirely gone. It wasn't fear she felt, more a lingering connection, as though a part of Eleanor had stayed with her, watching over her. The next day, as she unpacked boxes in her new apartment, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was short and simple. "Hi, Sophia. It's David. Is the bathroom supposed to make noises? Just wondering." Sophia stared at the message, her heart skipping a beat. She debated whether to respond. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered what to say. Finally, she typed back, "It's an old building. The pipes are probably just settling." But even as she sent the message, a shiver ran down her spine. A few weeks later, Sophia found herself standing in front of a modest gravestone in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town. After uncovering Eleanor's story, she had searched for her final resting place, determined to pay her respects. The gravestone was simple, marked only with Eleanor's name and the dates of her short life, 1920 to 1943. Sophia knelt down, brushing leaves away from the base of the stone. She placed a small bouquet of white lilies there, the delicate petals trembling in the breeze. "I hope you're at peace now," she said softly, her voice carried away by the wind. "People know your story, Eleanor. They won't forget you." She stayed there for a while, the autumn sun warming her face as she sat in silence. It felt right to be there, to acknowledge Eleanor not as a ghost or a tragic figure, but as a person who had lived, struggled, and deserved to be remembered. As Sophia stood to leave, she thought she felt a faint warmth on her shoulder, like a gentle hand resting there. She turned, but the cemetery was empty. David, the new tenant, settled into the apartment quickly. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. He decorated the space with his books, records, and a collection of plants that thrived in the apartment's natural light. The bathroom, however, remained an enigma. Every so often, he would hear faint gurgles from the drain, or notice the mirror fogging up, even when the room wasn't humid. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he thought he heard a faint whisper. He froze, staring at his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he saw something, just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but the bathroom was empty. David shook his head, laughing nervously. "It's just an old building," he muttered to himself. "Nothing to worry about." But as he left the bathroom, the faintest of whispers followed him. "I see you." Though Sophia had moved on, the apartment retained traces of its past, as if the walls themselves held memories that couldn't be erased. Eleanor's spirit had quieted, her story finally told, but the building's history was deep, layered with the lives and tragedies of those who had come before. For Sophia, Eleanor was more than a ghost. She was a reminder of the power of stories, of the way they could transcend death and time. And though Sophia no longer lived in the apartment, she carried Eleanor's legacy with her, a quiet voice urging her to listen, to remember, and to bear witness. Because some spirits never truly leave. They linger in the corners of our lives, not to haunt us, but to remind us of what we owe to the past and to each other.